Between the years 1500 and 1866, around 12 million African slaves were transported across the Atlantic Ocean to America. I'm sure you've heard the grotesque and inhuman horrors that they faced upon arrival to the new continent, but the trip across the ocean was just as barbaric. Join us today while we dive into the horrible truth of what life was like aboard a slave ship. So, how would one find themselves in the dire situation of being shipped halfway across the world as a slave? Well, it's a common misconception that the European slave traders would just roam around Africa, stealing away slaves from villages. Whilst this did, of course, happen, it's important to note that the majority of the poor souls that found themselves as slaves were sold into slavery after being captured in wars and raids by African kings or tribe leaders. One famous African king, King Tegbesu from the Kingdom of Dahomey, was raking in a whopping £250,000 a year from selling his captured enemies into slavery. The majority of this kingdom's wealth actually came from selling people into the transatlantic slave trade. Now, please note that this is a drastic oversimplification of the complex history of the capture and enslavement of millions of innocent people, but this video aims to shed light on a different section of the slave trade, so I'll digress. Once someone had been captured, much sorrow would befall them before they were sold to the European slave traders. Often people would have to wait in the dark cellars and dungeons of European-built castles and forts on the coast, such as the pictured Elmina Castle in modern-day Ghana. Once inside one of these hellholes, the dream of escape was but a faint whisper in the wind. Days, weeks or months would pass before the ships arrived, and the slaves were herded like cattle aboard. The one-way trip to America would now be underway. Slave ships ranged in size from small 10-ton boats all the way up to 566-ton monstrosities. These colossal ships could hold up to 700 slaves at any one time. However, most of the ships lay somewhere in the middle, carrying a few hundred at a time. As one can imagine, the conditions on the ship were appalling. The men were packed tightly together below deck like toes in a ballerina's shoe. They were bound together with leg irons, causing the tiniest movement by one man to send ripples through the rest. There was so little room that they were often forced to spend all day and night crouched or even lying down, with the roof overhead sometimes being as low as 4.5 feet. The women and children were kept separate from the men. This was sometimes above deck, but oftentimes they were also kept below. Being kept below deck left them in a similarly harrowing situation as the men, but in the certain circumstances that they were kept above deck, a somehow worse fate awaited them, as they were left prey to the wickedness of man. The air below deck was putrid, with little to no ventilation and absolutely zero sanitation. The living quarters of the slaves would quickly turn into a cesspit for disease. Fever, dysentery and smallpox were extremely frequent, and many, many slaves died a slow and agonizing death in these simply barbaric conditions, with little, if ever, any help. 80 days. 80 days of hell stood between boarding a ship and landing in the Americas. There comes a point when the human spirit cannot bear to continue. Sadly, for many of the slaves on these ships, this point was reached. It was commonplace for the crew of the ship to hang netting around the outside to catch any slaves who threw themselves over the edge to end their torment. So common, in fact, that it is said that shivers of sharks would follow the ships, silently waiting for the meal that they were sure would come. In other circumstances, the enslaved men and women would rise up against the crew of the ship and attempt an insurrection. Whilst this was rarely successful, there are a few recorded cases such as when the enslaved people aboard the Clare mutinied and successfully drove the crew from the vessel. They landed near the Cape Coast Castle on the Gold Coast in 1729 and liberated themselves. Unfortunately, this was not the case for the majority of slaves. Instead, they were forced to suffer the torment of the Middle Passage, only to land in America to live the rest of their lives as a possession, not a person. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video or learned something new, please subscribe for more interesting tales from history. Goodbye.